where we will set out our advice to Trevor Phillips and indeed Dame Louise Casey, who have shown quite clearly that integration is not improving in this country. Indeed, communities are becoming more divided. Something has to be done, and that's why we are setting out our integration agenda today. What we want to see is people sign up to British law, sign up to a British way of life, and indeed enjoy the full fruits our great society has to offer. And on that note, I will hand over to UKIP's education spokesman, David Curtin.
Thank you so much, Paul. 3 years ago, in 2014, news broke of the so-called Trojan horse scandal. It took many people by surprise in this country. Over 21 schools in Birmingham had been deliberately targeted by Islamists who wanted to take over the schools and use them to propagate Islamist ideology to children. At first it was dismissed as a conspiracy theory, but the depth and stealth of the plan quickly became apparent. It nearly succeeded, however, because many of the officials who should have been alert were either sleeping at the wheel or were too afraid to act because of the fear of being seen to be politically incorrect. Thousands upon thousands of young hearts and minds in our schools, particularly our primary schools, were at risk, and we must never be found wanting in this area again. Islamism is a poisonous strain and ideology, and there's no doubt that it's being actively propagated by many who are connected and associated with sects such as Wahhabis, Salafists and Deobandis. Islamists hold the belief that all Islamic writings are literally true and should be implemented literally in all times and all places. And the tenets which they're trying to propagate in young minds in this country are wholly incompatible with our British society, which is founded upon our wider Judeo-Christian traditions and the values of the Enlightenment. Some of these tenets and beliefs include taqiyya, and part of which is where children are being taught and others are being taught to show friendship to unbelievers but hate them in your heart. Verses which say, do not make friends with Christians or Jews or unbelievers. That this nation, Britain, is designated as Dar al-Harb, literally the house of war, and it is the duty of those in this country to convert it to Dar al-Islam, literally the house of Islam. The belief that women are second-class citizens and should have unequal rights. Those who leave Islam are ex-Muslims, are apostates, and the rightful penalty for them is death. That homosexuals should be killed. The ideas and values which children receive when they are young last for a lifetime, particularly in primary schools. And it's utterly wicked to try to use schools to inculcate children with these beliefs and ideologies. But this was what people tried to make happen in Birmingham, and it's being done as well in places like Luton, Rotherham and East London. These are areas where there is little or no integration, and we have to be very careful that these things are not propagated there as well. Yet we seem not to have learned the lessons of 2014. Only 2 weeks ago, another school in London was found to have organised a trip to a mosque where hundreds of primary school children over a 2-day period met a radical imam who had been described by the High Court to have promoted and encouraged religious violence. We must take action to prevent these things from continuing to happen and to make sure that integration happens in these areas which are at risk. We propose 2 things in education. Firstly, until there is far better integration of the entire Muslim community, including Deobandis, Wahhabis and Salafists, there should be a moratorium on any new Islamic state schools, both secondary and especially primary. Secondly, if there is any evidence that children are being exposed to these ideologies that I've mentioned before, that school should be immediately suspended. And that would include the school I just mentioned in London. The school should be taken over by the Department for Education, investigated, and anyone who has a connection with a radical imam or a radical mosque, whether they're teachers or governors or senior staff, should be fired. Schools should also be suspended if FGM is being promoted, or there are extreme uniform requirements such as head coverings or veils, full face veils for girls. There is no need for any such uniform requirement in state schools in this country. Or if there is unequal access for girls and boys to music, dance, drama or sport. And particularly if there is hostility to this country, the West in general, America or Israel, and any promotion of boycotts of Israeli or Jewish products among the school community. Successive governments over the last 50 years have failed to address integration, and now schools in many of these areas are targets. We must make sure that that stops. We must make sure that all children in our schools have a wider experience of British society and are not simply taught that it is bad. These children are at risk of being radicalised. We ignore this at our peril. We need strong action, not political correctness, or we will all suffer the consequences as the number of areas with low integration spreads out and gets larger. It must be dealt with. We must see these children who are in these areas at risk as our children, and for their sake we need to deal with integration, and UKIP will deal with it. Thank you. And now I'll hand over to Margot Parker, who is UKIP spokesman for Women and Equalities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Good morning. The 20th century in Britain saw women fight for and largely win equal civil, social and political rights. The rising generations of British women have come to take such rights for granted. The history of women's emancipation, and indeed of women's repression, should tell us not to do so. Equal rights to inherit property did not arrive in our country until 1922. The right to vote was not granted to women until 1928. The Equal Pay Act did not come through until 1970. The Wide-Ranging Sex Discrimination Act came along in 1975. Rape in marriage was only made a crime in 1994. The rights of lesbians and unmarried women to adopt children was granted just 15 years ago. Other moves towards equality have been even more recent than that. For example, it was as recent as 1988 that the Olympic Games held its first women's 10,000 metres race. Nearly all of these advances came as a result of pressure and campaigning led by women themselves. The key point is this: we are only a couple of generations into the widespread acceptance of equal rights for women here in Britain, and worldwide this phenomenon has largely been confined to a handful of advanced nations. So do not think that which was hard gained, recently arrived and geographically limited cannot be taken away again. While one cannot make a direct comparison because of the significant political, religious and cultural differences between their country and ours, I nevertheless often think how significant rights won by women in Iran were. For instance, they were stripped from them almost overnight. Within months of the founding of the Islamic Republic in Iran in 1979, the 1967 Family Protection Law was repealed. Female government workers were forced to observe Islamic dress code. Women were barred from becoming judges. Beaches and sports were sex segregated. And the legal age of marriage for girls was reduced to just 9, and married women were barred from attending regular schools. We must never take our freedoms for granted, and we must always be prepared to keep fighting for them. Whatever it is that unusually allowed women's rights to advance so spectacularly in our country in the 20th century needs protecting and bolstering. It must therefore follow that crude multiculturalism, the notion that new migrant groups should be at liberty to follow unmodernised culture and lifestyle of their country of origin, is the enemy of women's rights. There is no culture that I'm aware of that has been imported and allowed to persist unmodernised in Britain under the banner of multiculturalism, in which women are in the possession of elevated or superior rights or status as compared to men. There are several in which women are treated as second-class citizens. At their most extreme, some of these cultures doom women to live in pre-emancipation conditions, victims of vote stealing, prevented under the threat of violence from existing sexual self-determination, and even subjected to childhood abomination of female genital mutilation. And rather than integrating and taking on the superior values of Britain, these Islamic communities, they are often overwhelmingly Islamic, I have to say, are becoming more and more segregated, more militant over time about imposing and regressive values of their countries of origin, putting it upon British localities. The main victims of this phenomenon are British Muslim women and girls. They are not the only victims. Some men in these communities have shown themselves eager to treat non-Muslim women and girls who do not uphold their notions of female modesty in a disgraceful way. There have been instances of women deemed to be in Muslim areas being abused by the way they are dressed, or for holding hands, or kissing a boyfriend in public. Worse, by far, is the multiple instances of grooming and rape gangs made up almost entirely of Muslim men, targeting women entirely of non-Muslim girls and young women. Given that our Muslim population is the fastest growing section in our society, it is now of paramount importance that responsible politicians bolster the views and arguments of liberal Muslims who wish for their communities to break free of backward traditions prevalent in their countries of heritage and origin, and embrace a modern Britain. As Trevor Phillips has put it, we have to adopt a far more muscular approach to integration, more than ever replacing the failed policy of multiculturalism. The ideas which I will outline for you now are my contribution to such a muscular approach, and I urge politicians from other parties to show more courage in this issue and to speak out now. Let us start with the scourge of female genital mutilation. It is now widely accepted that many thousands of British girls every year have this grievous and life-changing abomination carried out upon them, and yet not a single person has ever been prosecuted in connection with it. In 2003, the FGM Act, which made it a criminal offence for British citizens to carry out or facilitate FGM, even in a country where the practice is legal, must therefore be deemed to be a failure. In my opinion, the law needs to go much further. I propose that the failure to report, for instance, of FGM should become a specific criminal offence for any adult with knowledge that such an act has occurred. I also propose that medical practitioners should be required to set aside patient confidentiality and report cases of physical abuse against children, and that girls identified to be at risk of FGM are required to have medical examinations every year and whenever they return from abroad. All these measures to combat this despicable crime are already law in France, a country with a far, far better record than us on FGM. Not only have they proven effective both in protecting girls in France from FGM, they've also helped provide essential evidence to mount prosecutions where FGM has taken place. It is time the United Kingdom caught up. Given the worrying statements by the West Midlands Police Force, which suggested they may not prosecute parents when FGM had taken place. I further propose that the Crown Prosecution Service should be made to work to a presumption of prosecution of any parent whose daughter has suffered FGM. Together, I believe these proposals will at last create a meaningful deterrent against this disgusting crime and send out a long overdue signal that Britain will not tolerate this anymore. Not only have our law enforcement agencies too often turned a blind eye to FGM, they've done so with the so-called honour violence too. And I propose that police forces and Crown Prosecution Service officers be instructed that far from treading lightly in order to avoid infringing minority culture and sensitivities, they adopt a zero-tolerance approach to such offending in order that people in minority communities can enjoy majority rights. But what about these measures right now? What can we do to protect our vulnerable girls? Well, there are these grooming gangs, and they have been very active in many places. Well, I have a proposal here as well. Where the victim of a grooming gang is from a different ethnic or religious background, then the perpetrators, this should be regarded by the legal system as an aggravated factor in the offence. In other words, when gangs of Pakistani heritage men rape and abuse working class white girls, as has happened in so many towns and cities, it should now be treated as a hate crime. That is the exact opposite of how it was treated, and in the days when political correctness led police forces to ignore such evil in their midst. My colleague in the European Parliament, Jane Collins, has done exceptional work in exposing the horrors of the grooming gangs in Rochdale and elsewhere. And such a proposal builds on and boosts her very excellent campaigning work. The last proposal I should be submitting at this stage to Suzanne Evans and her policy scrutiny team is a more general point. It is simply that British welfare state and all its sizes must always penalise and never reward kidney. Whether this is in regard to housing, allocation, benefits, payouts, or any other form of support, polygamy has always led to women being treated as second-class citizens, and we must give it no quarter. Please don't get me wrong. In focusing on this particular cultural element of women's rights, I'm not blind to the fact that Western culture has its own problems with female emancipation. The development and acceptance of so-called lab culture, in which young women are treated as sex objects, and commonly found media exploitation and objectation of women, the red circle of shame in celebrity magazines that holds women to unattainable levels of physical perfection, destroying self-esteem and body confidence. These are just a couple of examples of how our own culture is failing women, and it shows us that even free from the bitterly prescriptive and bigoted diktats of a regressive religion, we still have a long way to go. But this sad truth must never be allowed to be present and be a valid argument against tackling the worst excesses of violence against women, and that we see in the minority communities. By raising the priority we give to integration, UKIP is acting in a positive and progressive force in society. Most importantly, we will be the party that works hardest to ensure that the rights hard won by women in the 20th century are not taken away in the 21st century. And we must remember that we're fighting for all women, regardless of their race, their religion, or their background. Thank you. My pleasure now to introduce our Deputy Leader, Peter Whittle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margot. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The United Kingdom is entering a new era. The vote to leave the undemocratic EU and once again control our own destiny was a landmark of truly historic proportions for our country. But it was also profound in another sense. It marked a return to the prominence of the nation state. Unlike the money is everything Tories and the Britain haters of Labour, UKIP has always believed in and celebrated our nation, our values and our history. The massive political changes happening around the world have proved what we in UKIP have always known, that the biggest issues of our time are cultural ones. It is not just about money or the bottom line or knowing the price of everything and the value of nothing. So, alongside being the only true party of proper migration controls, we are the party that cares and indeed talks not just about the economic effects, but also the cultural impact of mass migration. We are the party that speaks up about the threats we face from Islamism, from without and within, at a time when the established parties are mute, either from fear, denial, or sheer cowardice. We are the party that fights the increasing encroachments on free speech, which have come from an entrenched but misplaced cultural sensitivity. We believe that a country springs not just from a balance sheet, but from a shared connection to a place and identity, whether it be family, local community, or indeed a broader nation. Now, UKIP has always been at its best when it is radical. We have never been afraid to discuss those issues which mean so much to ordinary people, but on which the old parties have closed down the debate for so long. UKIP is the party that stands for a country that is united under the same set of laws and values. But Britain is becoming more fragmented. This is the direct result of a public policy of multiculturalism. It has emphasised separateness, it has vehemently disallowed criticism. It has treated all practices and traditions, however much they might offend our values and indeed our laws, as being of equal standing. It has been championed most fiercely by those who have little interest in preserving British identity, or who are indeed hostile to the very idea of it. Over generations, we've therefore seen where this has led us. Far from getting people to mix, it has instead produced in many parts of our country what can only be described as a series of monocultural islands. And we should remember this: nobody voted for this. Nobody voted for multiculturalism, and yet we are now living with the results of it. It is no wonder that even some voices in the old parties have raised concerns about the failure of such an approach, yet they do nothing. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we in UKIP do stand up for our values, and we do want people to integrate properly. We believe firmly that a multi-ethnic society can be a harmonious and successful one if it is bound together by an overarching attachment to Britain and British identity. Now, Britain has always been a welcoming society to people of whatever faith, nationality, or creed who have wanted to make this country their home. But we believe that those faiths and beliefs must exist firmly within a British framework. We believe that the time has come where we have to put markers down and say, this is what we are, and this is what we believe in. First, we firmly believe, of course, in the rule of law. Now, that law is British law. A society that can pick and choose a legal system gradually ceases to be a society at all. No parallel system should ever be allowed to impinge on the integrity of British law. There must be no tolerance of systems which deny the equal rights of men and women. The rights of women, for these are the most affected by such practices, should and must extend to all parts of our society, regardless of religion or ethnicity. Now, the public are rightly alarmed at the growth in Sharia courts and the apparent unwillingness of the political class who face up to this. It is our intention, therefore, to ban Sharia law, a system which is intended as a rival to our own and which undermines women's rights. We want to ban it from being applied in the UK. So to this end, we would establish a legal commission to draw up proposals to disband Sharia courts. It is simple. There has got to be one law for all. We take the same approach to our values. One of the foundations of British society is that we communicate by seeing each other's faces clearly. Face coverings such as the Islamic veil are a deliberate barrier to integration. They say, don't speak to me, I will not speak to you. They are, furthermore, a potent symbol of female oppression against which many women in Islamic countries have fought and continue to fight. And in many contexts, of course, too, they also constitute an increasingly serious security risk. UKIP proposes that the time has come to outlaw them. Again, it is quite simple. People should show their face in a public place. Likewise, again, in the interest of integration, a common language is essential. It is the glue that keeps our society together. And not being able to speak it acts as a serious barrier not only to integration but to employment. So here we reiterate our policy that all official documents should be in English and English alone. Only then will there be a true incentive to learn the common language. And the current situation simply facilitates further separation. Finally, Britain has always enjoyed an electoral process relatively free from corruption and manipulation. However, as we have seen in places such as Tower Hamlets, this has been put under increasing strain in recent years by the importing of cultural practices which go against our own. In particular, postal voting on demand has led to a boom in electoral fraud and vote stealing, especially amongst some minority communities. So to help combat this, UKIP would revert to the system as it existed before, whereby a higher threshold of demonstrable need is demonstrated before a postal vote is granted. Ladies and gentlemen, we're living in a time where Labour and its politicians are increasingly talk to segregated audiences. Theresa May and the Tories make sometimes very radical pronouncements and then do precisely nothing. And that is because they simply do not care. Well, we have to have confidence in ourselves if indeed we are to promote a unifying British culture. Certainly that culture could be one, and we want it to be, which is open to anyone who wishes to identify with us and our values. But our own belief in the greatness of our traditions, values, and our culture is vital. It is one which we in UKIP will not shy away from expressing loud and clear. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll have time for just a few questions. I'm going to ask David Curtin and Margaret Hart to join me here so they can answer your questions on their particular bits, if you have any. David, Margaret. Yes.
Thank you. Alex Forsyth, BBC News. Is there a danger that by targeting the Muslim community, you actually increase segregation rather than promote integration?
I would answer that by your very question there, that is exactly what people say when they want to close argument down. I'm not suggesting that that's what you're saying, but that is generally the approach, which is that if you sort of do this, if you say this, you are Islamophobic or you're racist in some way, and what happens is that the problems go on exactly as they were before. I think that there is a general consensus that these are the sort of issues that have to be dealt with. And basically people say this, but then they do absolutely nothing about it. And the time has come where these issues now are absolutely compelling. So this is why we are setting out our agenda today. Thank you. Chris.
Chris O'Connor, does your ban apply to all face coverings like beekeepers? Or is it just Muslim people, in which case is it racist?
It's absolutely ridiculous. First of all, I would make, this is what you call a major straw man point. Of course not. That's ridiculous. We are talking about a face covering which is actually, more often than not the choice, actually, of the person wearing it. And of course it is an absolute barrier in a public place to us being able to communicate with each other. That is before you even get to the security angle. Even if there were not a security angle, I would add, it should still be banned. And I would also add another thing, is that France has done this, Belgium has done this, Bulgaria has done this, even the biggest group in the EU Parliament is now wanting an EU-wide ban on the face up.
So just to be clear, a woman goes out into the street wearing a full Muslim covering, you would expect people to be able to say, call the police, this woman's committing a crime, and she would be potentially prosecuted and potentially end up in prison. I mean, that is the logic of saying this would be banned, this would be outlawed. I mean, you're prepared to see that happen?
Do you want to answer that?
Yes, I will. I mean, let's be fair here. In France, they impose a fine. You have to educate the population. So this is what we're going to do. You don't just throw it out there at random. You deal with it in a sensitive, sensible way. After all, we want to make people inclusive. The whole idea is integration, not segregation. So let me bring you back to that. It is important that we must tell people, really, this is for you. We really want you to play a very important part in our society. Women are not second-class citizens. That makes them one.
The logic is, they could be crime and the people in prison.
Not a crime.
Peter, Darren from Sky News. 2013, that man in the corner, Paul Nuttall, said we wouldn't go down the route of forcing the blanket ban. We are a libertarian party. Are you today, in 2017, a libertarian party? And isn't it truth? Isn't it truth that UKIP's vote has been squeezed? This is pretty desperate stuff.
No, it's not desperate stuff at all. First of all, this was our policy in 2010. And the fact is that, okay, this is, in the media's eyes at least, this election is being played out very much in terms of Brexit. But these issues are of existential importance. They are ones that are growing in people's minds, increasing concern about them and indeed anger about them. Not fear, because quite often people are characterised, so they say, don't stoke people's fears. Well, we don't patronise people in that way. We know what people feel about these things. We have to express that. Ian.
Hi, Ian Silveri, International Business Times. You said you wanted to work with liberal Muslims. How many liberal Muslims have you consulted for these policies?
Well, an enormous number, and quite frankly,
how many?
You want me to give you a 1 to 10? I'm not going to do that. Let's not trivialise it. Let's think about the facts, why we're here today. We want to work together. We will invite, naturally, any comments from any organisations that wish to engage with us. Fine, wonderful. That's what we're about. Integration.
I think it's got 2 more left.
Hi, Jessica Albert from The Guardian. The Tories are clearly taking a huge chunk of the UKIP vote. Are you now trying to take the BNP and Britain first?
Oh, come on, I mean, I haven't got a clue what those thugs think about these sorts of things. I have no idea and I have no interest, actually. And the fact is that when you say, are we taking that vote, I just said, you know, we are actually going in line with Europe. We're actually going in line with the biggest grouping in the EU Parliament. Were you calling them the BNP too?
On checking for FGM, so Vince McAviney, LBC, on checking for FGM, how are you going to identify girls at risk? How many do you think are there at risk? Are you going to do this via the NHS or the police? And are you going to liberate Catholic nuns from wearing a habit as well, if that suppresses religious dress?
Well, let's take the Catholic nuns. I'm a Catholic. They don't cover their full face. I can see their face.
And on the point about
FGM. On the point of actually implementing, of course you have to work with the NHS, you've got to work with doctors, you've got to work with healthcare workers, you've got to work right through society. This is something that we want to stop, this abomination. So you have to be serious about it.
So you're going to send doctors into schools
We're not going to
check
send them
the
into schools. There are lots of things you can do. They can be in schools. Of course, you can have health officers going into schools. But within the practice of certain surgeries, clearly, they will see what's going on. And it is a duty to report it.
Do you not think it's wrong to make them have to expose
We're going to have to leave,
themselves?
ladies and gentlemen. I think we're going to have to leave. No one's going to but we can make interviews and everything out there. So thank you very, very much indeed for coming. Thank you.